The sun fell through the dirty windows of the barracks, casting long shadows across William Voss's bunk. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light as he methodically folded his few possessions into a standard-issue duffel bag. Around him, other men of the 107th Infantry Division performed the same ritual, some chattering with nervous energy, others silent in contemplation of what awaited them on the European front. Will tucked a dog-eared photograph beneath his spare socks, a smiling young woman with chestnut hair, standing before a maple tree in autumn. The image was worn at the corners from countless nights of being held, studied, cherished during his training at Camp Edwards. He ran his thumb across her face, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. "Still carrying a torch for your sweetheart back home, Voss?" Private Jenkins tossed a rolled pair of wool socks into his own bag. "What's her name again?" "Lucy?" "Lillian," Will corrected quietly. "Lillian Lawrence. Pretty name for a pretty gal." Jenkins nodded toward the photograph. "She waiting for you?" Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She was. The past tense hung heavy in the air between them, and Jenkins had enough sense not to press further. The barracks fell silent save for the rustling of clothing and the distant sound of a sergeant shouting orders across the parade ground. That evening, as they boarded the troop transport that would carry them to England, Will thought of the last time he'd held Lillian's hand. It had been a crisp October day in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before the world had completely come apart at the seams. They'd walked through Boston Common, kicking through piles of fallen leaves, making plans for a future that had seemed so certain. "When we're married," she'd said, her voice light with dreams, "I'd like a small house. Nothing fancy. Just room enough for us and maybe a dog." "And children?" Will had asked, squeezing her hand. "Two," she'd answered definitively. "A boy and a girl." "Just like that?" "You can decide." "Watch me," she'd laughed, that bright, silvery laugh that had first drawn him to her at a church social 3 years prior. For months later, he'd received his draft notice. 2 months after that, the telegram arrived. Lillian's parents' home in Dorchester had taken a direct hit during a catastrophic gas main explosion while she was visiting. 3 families lost. No survivors. The Atlantic crossing was brutal. February storms tossed the overcrowded transport ship like a child's toy in a bathtub. Seasickness became as common as breathing. Will spent the nights on deck when possible, staring at stars partially obscured by clouds, wondering if Lillian could see the same constellations from wherever souls went after they departed. They landed in Scotland and were transported by rail to southern England. The English countryside rolled past the train windows, green fields, stone cottages, church spires, all of it oddly peaceful despite the war that raged across the Channel. Occasionally they'd pass evidence of German bombing, a roofless house, a crater in a field, the blackened skeleton of a factory. Will's division spent 3 months training in England before receiving orders for the invasion. June 5, 1944. The night before D-Day. The men sat in small groups, writing letters, playing cards, praying, or simply sitting in silence. Will wrote to his parents, choosing his words carefully, avoiding anything that might worry them more than necessary if the worst should happen. The landing craft approached the Normandy coast under heavy fire. The sound was deafening: artillery shells, machine guns, the screams of wounded men. Will watched the ramp lower, revealing a stretch of beach already littered with bodies. When the order came, he ran forward with the others, splashing through blood-tinged seawater toward the seawall. 3 weeks later, pushing inland through the Norman hedgerows, Will took shrapnel in his left leg and right shoulder. The field hospital was overwhelmed, a maze of canvas tents filled with wounded men on stretchers. The air smelled of antiseptic, blood, and fear. "You're lucky, soldier," the doctor told him after surgery. 6 inches to the right and you'd be going home in a pine box. Lucky wasn't the word Will would have chosen. He was being transferred to a recovery hospital in England, away from his unit, away from the men he'd trained with and fought beside. But alive. Breathing when so many weren't. The hospital was a converted country estate outside of London. Elegant architecture now housed rows of beds filled with broken men. Large windows let in light and air, a stark contrast to the mud and blood of the front. Will's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy, bland meals, and endless hours of staring at the ceiling, listening to other men's nightmares. Mail call, a nurse announced one afternoon in August, moving between the beds with a stack of letters and packages. Will wasn't expecting anything. His parents wrote regularly, but he'd received their latest letter just 2 days prior. When the nurse stopped at his bed and handed him an envelope, he stared at it with confusion. "It's addressed to you, Lieutenant," she said with a smile. "Secret admirer, perhaps?" The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, feminine script. There was no return address. Will tore it open with his good hand and unfolded a single sheet of stationery. "Dear Lieutenant Voss, you don't know me, but I work for the BBC in London. I'm writing to you about a broadcast we aired 3 days ago, featuring American servicemen sending messages home. One of our engineers noticed something peculiar afterward. In the background of one recording, barely audible, a female voice can be heard saying what sounds like your name. We've enclosed a note with the date and time of our next broadcast featuring that segment, should you wish to listen. Yours sincerely Margaret Thornhill BBC production assistant will read the letter twice, then a third time. A mistake, surely. Some confusion, or perhaps a cruel joke. But why would anyone bother? He tucked the letter under his pillow and tried to forget about it. That evening, he asked one of the orderlies if there was a radio he could use. The man returned with a small set and placed it on Will's bedside table. "Need help tuning it?" the orderly asked. Will shook his head. "I can manage." At precisely 8 o'clock, he turned the dial to the BBC frequency noted in the letter. After a news bulletin about Allied advances in France came the segment, recordings of American soldiers sending messages to loved ones back home. He listened intently through 3 messages, feeling increasingly foolish. Then a fourth began, a corporal from Minnesota sending birthday wishes to his little sister. As the man's message concluded, Will reached to turn off the radio. Then he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible beneath the station identification. A woman's voice, soft but clear. "Will Voss, can you hear me?" The radio slipped from his hand, clattering against the metal bed frame. The patients in nearby beds glanced over in annoyance, but Will barely noticed. He knew that voice. Had dreamed of it for months. Lillian's voice. Impossible. The next morning, Will persuaded a sympathetic nurse to let him use the hospital telephone. It took 3 calls to reach Margaret Thornhill at the BBC. "Yes, Lieutenant, I sent that letter," she confirmed. "I'm glad you heard the broadcast. Miss Thornhill, I need to know, who made that recording? Where was it done? That's why I wrote to you. It wasn't part of any recording. We have no idea where it came from. It simply appeared in the broadcast. That's not possible." "I agree, Lieutenant. Our engineers have no explanation. The voice wasn't present in the original recording of the soldier's message. It only manifested during transmission." Will's grip tightened on the receiver. "Will it be played again?" "We've been instructed not to air that particular recording again. Security concerns about unauthorized transmissions." "I need to hear it again," Will insisted, his voice rising enough to draw a warning glance from the nurse. There was a pause on the line. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. I shouldn't have even written to you. My supervisor would be furious if he knew." "Please," Will said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The woman whose voice I heard, I thought she was dead." Another pause, longer this time. "Come to Broadcasting House tomorrow at 4. Ask for me at reception." The nurse helped Will arrange transportation to London the next day, a favor that cost him his chocolate ration for a week. He made the journey in uniform, his legs still stiff, using a cane that he resented but couldn't manage without. Broadcasting House stood imposing in Portland Place, its curved facade a stark contrast to the bomb-damaged buildings surrounding it. Will identified himself at reception, and soon Margaret Thornhill appeared, a tall woman in her 30s with practical clothes and an efficient manner. Lieutenant Voss. Follow me, please. She led him through a maze of corridors to a small recording studio. Inside, a man in shirt sleeves looked up from a control panel. This is Mr. Bennett, our chief engineer, Margaret explained. He's agreed to let you listen to the original recording. Bennett nodded curtly. 10 minutes, Miss Thornhill. Then I've got the home service broadcast to prepare. He threaded a reel of tape onto a machine and adjusted several dials. This is the master recording of Corporal Dalton's message, before broadcast. The familiar voice of the Minnesota corporal filled the small room. When it ended, Will waited, but there was nothing else. Now, Bennett said, threading a different reel, this is the recording of what actually went out over the air. Again, the corporal's message played. Then, clearly audible, Will Voss, can you hear me? Will closed his eyes. Lillian's voice. No doubt in his mind. Play it again, he requested. Bennett complied, watching Will's face closely. You recognize the voice? Margaret asked quietly. Will nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Lieutenant, I need to be clear, Bennett said, removing his glasses. This shouldn't be possible. The voice isn't on any recording we made. It somehow entered the broadcast during transmission. Could someone have interfered with the signal? Will asked. Possibly, but with extraordinary precision and timing. And to what end? To send a personal message to one American soldier. Will had no answer for that. Had there been other incidents like this? Bennett and Margaret exchanged glances. 3 that we've documented, she said. All within the past month. All women's voices, all saying specific names. Have you located any of the women? Bennett shook his head. The names mentioned were of servicemen. Like you. And the voices? We don't know who they belong to, Margaret said gently. That's why I wrote to you. We hoped you might have some insight. Will stared at the tape machine. The woman whose voice you recorded, I believed she died in Boston over a year ago. The silence in the studio grew heavy. Lieutenant, Bennett finally said, I'm a man of science. I deal in frequencies, amplitudes, and electrical signals. I don't have explanations for whatever this is. Can I hear it once more? Will asked. Bennett nodded and started the tape again. Will Voss, can you hear me? For words. Will closed his eyes, letting them wash over him. When he opened them again, both Margaret and Bennett were watching him with concern. Thank you, he said stiffly, reaching for his cane. I appreciate your time. Lieutenant, Margaret called as he turned to leave. If you learn anything, would you let us know? Will nodded, though he had no intention of returning to Broadcasting House. What could he possibly tell them? That he recognized the voice of his dead fiancée? That he had no more explanation than they did? That night, back in his hospital bed, Will couldn't sleep. He kept hearing those 4 words, spoken in Lillian's unmistakable voice. It was impossible, yet he had heard it with his own ears. Will Voss, can you hear me? Yes, he could hear her. But how could she speak to him? And from where? The next morning, Will asked to use the telephone again. This time, he placed a call to his parents in Massachusetts. Will. What a wonderful surprise, his mother exclaimed. Are you all right? Your last letter said you were recovering well. I'm fine, Mother, he assured her. I'm calling about something else. Have you heard anything about the Lawrences? About Lillian? The line went quiet for a moment. Oh, Will. Why are you asking about that now? It's been over a year. Please, Mother. It's important. He heard her sigh. No, nothing new. It was a terrible tragedy. The whole neighborhood mourned them. Was there ever? Did they find? They found remains, Will. The explosion and fire were devastating. Several families were never fully accounted for. You know this? Yes, he said quietly. I know. After ending the call, Will sat in the hospital's telephone alcove for a long time, staring at nothing. The rational part of his mind knew that Lillian was gone. Yet he had heard her voice, as clear as if she were standing beside him. Lieutenant Voss. A nurse touched his shoulder gently. Are you all right? He nodded mechanically. Just tired. You have a visitor waiting. She says she's from the BBC. Will frowned. Miss Thornhill. Yes, that's the name. Shall I tell her you're not up to visitors? No, Will said, pushing himself up with his cane. I'll see her. Margaret was waiting in the hospital's small visitors' lounge, looking somehow out of place among the convalescing soldiers and their family members. Lieutenant, she said, standing as he approached. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Not at all, Will replied, lowering himself carefully into a chair. Though I'm surprised to see you. There's been another broadcast incident, she said without preamble. Last night. The same voice. Will felt his heart rate quicken. Saying what? I'm still here, Will. Station 47. Will stared at her. Station 47? What does that mean? We don't know. It's not a BBC frequency or call sign. She hesitated. Lieutenant, my superiors are concerned. They're treating these incidents as potential security breaches. If someone can insert messages into our broadcasts. It's not espionage, Will said firmly. How can you be certain? Because I know that voice. He leaned forward. Miss Thornhill, could your engineers determine where the transmission originated? She shook her head. Not precisely. Somewhere in London, they believe, but that's all. Station 47, Will repeated. Does that mean anything in London? A train station? A radio station? Not that I'm aware of, but I'll make inquiries. Margaret studied his face. You believe this is genuinely the woman you knew? Not someone imitating her voice. I don't know what to believe, Will admitted. But I need to find out. Over the next week, Will and Margaret met daily. She brought him maps of London, lists of radio frequencies, directories of broadcasting facilities. Nothing matched Station 47. Meanwhile, there were no further mysterious voice intrusions on BBC broadcasts. Will's doctors noted his improved spirits and energy, attributing it to his recovery progressing well. They didn't know that he lay awake each night, listening to the small radio beside his bed, hoping to hear Lillian's voice again. Then, 9 days after Margaret's visit, a young nurse named Ruth approached Will during breakfast. Lieutenant Voss? There's a telephone call for you. A lady says it's urgent. Will made his way to the telephone as quickly as his healing leg would allow. Hello? Lieutenant, it's Margaret Thornhill. I found something. Station 47 isn't a radio station or a train station. It's the code designation for a classified communications facility in Hampstead. It was used early in the war for intercepting enemy transmissions, but it was damaged in the Blitz and officially decommissioned in 1943. Is it still standing? Yes, but it's supposed to be abandoned. Lieutenant, this is a military facility. We can't simply walk in. No, Will agreed. I'll go alone. That's not what I meant, Margaret protested. We should inform the authorities. And tell them what? That I heard my dead fiancé's voice on the radio, telling me to go to an abandoned listening post. They'd have me committed. There was a pause on the line. I'll pick you up at 2 o'clock. But if we find anything suspicious, we alert the authorities immediately. Agreed. The facility sat on a hilltop in North London, surrounded by a chain-link fence with faded no trespassing signs. The main building was a 2-story brick structure with boarded windows and a sagging roof. Two rusted antenna towers rose behind it, silhouetted against the cloudy afternoon sky. "Charming," Margaret commented as she parked her small Austin on a service road 50 yards from the fence. "Are you sure about this, Lieutenant?" Will was already getting out of the car, his cane sinking slightly into the soft ground. "I'm sure." They found a place where the fence had been damaged, likely by local children using the abandoned site for explorations. Margaret hesitated. "This is trespassing on government property." "You can wait in the car," Will offered. She sighed and followed him through the gap in the fence. The building's main entrance was locked, but a side door hung partially open, its lock broken. Inside, the air was musty and stale. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The ground floor contained several empty rooms with peeling paint and water-damaged ceilings. "Hello?" Will called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" Silence answered him. They found a staircase and climbed to the second floor, Will wincing as he navigated the steps with his cane. More empty rooms awaited them, some still containing metal desks and filing cabinets. One larger room held the remains of what appeared to be a radio setup, empty equipment racks, disconnected cables hanging from the ceiling, and one dust-covered control panel. "This place has been stripped," Margaret observed. "Whatever was here is long gone." Will moved to a window and managed to peer through a gap in the boards. The view overlooked London, the city sprawling toward the distant Thames. From this height, bomb damage was clearly visible, entire blocks reduced to rubble, the scars of the Blitz etched into the urban landscape. "We should go," Margaret said, glancing at her watch. "It's getting late, and there's nothing here." Will turned from the window, feeling a profound sense of disappointment. He had been so certain they would find something. Some explanation. Some connection to Lillian. As they started toward the stairs, a faint sound caught Will's attention, a crackling, like static from a radio. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "Hear what?" The sound came again, slightly louder. Will followed it to a small door they had overlooked. It was locked. "There's something in there," Will said, trying the handle again. "Something electrical." "Stand back," Margaret said unexpectedly. She removed a hairpin from her upswept hair and inserted it into the lock. After a few moments of careful manipulation, there was a click, and the door swung open. Will stared at her in surprise. "My brother taught me," she explained with a slight smile. "Comes in handy more often than you'd think." The room beyond was tiny, barely larger than a closet. Unlike the rest of the building, it appeared untouched by time. A small radio transmitter sat on a desk, its power light glowing faintly. Beside it was a microphone and a logbook. Will approached slowly, as if in a dream. The transmitter hummed quietly, though it was connected to no visible power source. The logbook lay open, its pages blank except for a single line written in familiar handwriting, June 12, 1944, first contact established with Lieutenant W. Voss, 107th Infantry. The date was 4 days after Will had been wounded in Normandy. "This isn't possible," Margaret whispered, looking over his shoulder at the logbook. "This equipment should be dead. The power was cut to this building years ago." Will reached for the microphone, his hand trembling slightly. "Lillian," he said into it. "Lillian, are you there?" Static answered him, then cleared. "Will?" Her voice filled the small room, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "You found me?" Margaret gasped, stepping back until she bumped against the wall. Will gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. How is this possible?" he managed. "They told me you died." "The explosion?" "I did," Lillian's voice replied softly. "But I didn't leave." "Not completely." Will looked at Margaret, who stood frozen, her face pale with shock. "You can hear her?" Margaret nodded mutely. "Lillian," Will continued, turning back to the microphone. "I don't understand. How can you be speaking to me if you're dead?" Her voice held a sad smile. I'm not sure I understand it myself. When the explosion happened, I was thinking of you. Wishing I could hear your voice one more time. Then I was here. In between. In between what? I don't know. All I know is that I can reach out sometimes, when the conditions are right. It takes so much energy. I've been trying for months to find you. Will's mind reeled with questions, none of which had answers that could possibly make sense. Can I see you? A soft sigh came through the speaker. No, Will. I'm not corporeal anymore. This voice is all I have. The BBC broadcasts, Margaret said suddenly. You were trying to reach him through our transmissions. Yes, Lillian replied. I discovered I could push my voice into radio signals. The BBC reaches everywhere. I hoped Will would hear me. Will sank onto a dusty stool beside the desk, his injured leg aching from standing. Lillian, I've missed you so much. I know, she said gently. I've watched over you, whenever I could. I saw you on the beach in Normandy. I was with you in the field hospital. Tears pricked at Will's eyes. I felt you there. I thought I was delirious from the pain. No. It was me. Margaret stepped forward. Miss Lawrence, forgive my asking, but why are you still here? If you're deceased, shouldn't you have moved on? A long silence followed. I couldn't leave without saying goodbye, Lillian finally answered. Will and I never had that chance. Will wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. Lillian, I love you. I've never stopped loving you. I know, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. That's why I fought so hard to reach you. To tell you that I love you too. And that you need to let me go. The words hit Will like physical blows. Let you go? Now that I've found you again. You haven't found me, Will. You found an echo. A memory that's lingered too long. Her voice grew fainter. I can feel it now, the pull of whatever comes next. It's been getting stronger since you arrived. Don't go, Will pleaded, gripping the microphone. Please. I have to, she said gently. And you have to let me. You have a life to live, Will. A future. Not without you. Yes, without me. That's how it has to be. The static increased, her voice fading in and out. I just needed to say goodbye. To tell you that what we had was real and beautiful, even if it was too brief. Margaret placed a hand on Will's shoulder. She's right, Lieutenant. Will looked up at her through tear-filled eyes, then back at the microphone. Will I ever hear your voice again? I don't think so, Lillian answered, barely audible now. This connection is fading. But Will, I want you to know, I don't regret a single moment with you. The static grew louder, threatening to overwhelm her voice entirely. Lillian, wait, Will called desperately. The house we talked about. The one with room for us and a dog. And 2 children, she finished, a smile evident in her voice despite the static. A boy and a girl. I would have loved that life with you. I know. Her voice was a whisper now, barely distinguishable from the static. Goodbye, Will. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. The radio fell silent, the power light fading to nothing. The transmitter gave a final, soft click, then went dead. Will sat motionless, staring at the now silent equipment. Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently. Lieutenant, she said quietly. We should go. He nodded mechanically but made no move to stand. She's really gone now. Yes, Margaret agreed. But she found you. Across, whatever divide separates us from those who've passed. She found you to say goodbye. Will ran his fingers over the silent radio. How do I live with that? Knowing she was there all along, watching over me. You live, Margaret said simply. That's what she wanted. You heard her. They left the small room, closing the door behind them. As they made their way down the stairs and out of the building, the setting sun cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds. At the gap in the fence, Will paused and looked back at the abandoned listening post. In the fading light, he could almost imagine he saw a figure standing at one of the second-floor windows, a slender woman with chestnut hair. Then the last ray of sunlight faded, and there was nothing but an empty building on a lonely hill. 3 months later, Will was discharged from the hospital and deemed fit for limited duty. Rather than returning to the front, he was assigned to a logistics office in London, coordinating supply shipments to Allied forces continuing the push into Germany. Every Sunday, he took flowers to Hampstead Hill and left them at the fence surrounding Station 47. Sometimes Margaret joined him, especially after they began seeing each other socially in October. "Do you think she knows?" Margaret asked one crisp autumn afternoon, watching as Will placed a small bunch of daisies, Lillian's favorite, against the fence. "That I'm moving forward." Will considered the question. "Yes. I think that's what she wanted. Do you still miss her?" Will took Margaret's hand as they walked back to the car. "Every day. But differently now. It's not a raw wound anymore. More like the bittersweet memory." "That's healing," Margaret observed. "Painful, but necessary." Will nodded, glancing back at the abandoned building silhouetted against the sky. The war was winding toward its inevitable conclusion. Europe was battered but would rebuild. So would he. "She told me to be happy," he said quietly. "I'm trying." Margaret smiled and squeezed his hand. "One day at a time, Lieutenant. One day at a time." As they drove away, a faint breeze stirred the flowers at the fence. Miles away, a BBC announcer read the evening news, his voice travelling across the airwaves, reaching into homes throughout London and beyond. Among the millions listening, perhaps there was one presence that no longer needed radio waves to hear the voices of those she loved. Will never heard Lillian's voice on the radio again. But sometimes, in his dreams, he heard her laugh, that bright, silvery laugh that had first drawn him to her. And when he woke, he found the strength to face another day, carrying her memory not as a burden, but as a gift.